I must say that listening to Charlie distill about 15 years of scholarship at the Jesus Seminar into a couple of presentations, that's exactly what he did. It's both brilliant and it also lets you know that there's nothing settled. I gave up Q a long time ago. I think Q is Matthew, and that Luke had both Matthew and Mark in front of him, but that's another point of view that I think will someday gain some credence. It's helpful to me to think of the Bible not as a photograph, but as a portrait, because you read a portrait very differently from the way you read a photograph. I'm also convinced that people who think the Bible is the literal Word of God have never read it. You can't possibly read it and continue to think that. As a matter of fact, if we took the Bible literally, there wouldn't be a soul in this room still alive. You might look at the book of Deuteronomy that tells you that if a child is willfully disobedient and talks back to his or her parents, the child shall be taken to the elders of the city and stoned until dead at the gates of the city. Now, how many of you would still be alive if we took that literally? The Bible also says that if you commit adultery, you shall be put to death, but I'm not going to ask you how many of you would still be alive. And my favorite one, which I didn't discover until a few years ago, is in Leviticus, and it says that you shall be put to death if you have sex with your mother-in-law. How many of you knew that was in the Bible? How many of you have ever imagined it? And the reason you laugh is that you just tried to imagine it. A quick story before I begin. Some years ago I was on a book tour, and I was booked into a late-night talk show out of Burbank, California, with the talk show host, what was his name? He's dead now, but Tom Snyder, yeah, Tom Snyder. And Tom Snyder said that, Tom Snyder was a sort of lapsed Roman Catholic. He really didn't like the Roman Catholic Church at all, but that's the only church he knew. And we were talking about the dating of the books of the New Testament, and I suggested the Gospels are written between about 70 at the earliest and 100 at the latest. And he said, well, that means they weren't written by eyewitnesses. Nobody lived that long in the first century. I said, that's right, Tom, they aren't written by eyewitnesses. He said, that's not what the nuns taught me. I said, what did the nuns teach you, Tom? And he said, the nuns taught me that the disciples followed Jesus around and wrote down everything he said, and that's where we got the Gospels. And I said, Tom, did the nuns tell you that the disciples used ballpoint pens and spiral notebooks? And then I began to open his mind to the possibility that writing was very rare and very expensive in the first century. About 1 out of every 1,000 people were able to write in first century Judea. Anyway, we've been brainwashed over the centuries with biblicism, not Christianity, but a kind of biblicistic religion that makes it quite difficult to get out from under that without thinking the whole enterprise is disappearing. Well, let's go back and try to get into the context of my previous lecture so we'll know what we're building on. I suggested this morning that the traditional way of understanding Christianity presupposes a diagnosis of our humanity that is simply wrong. And that diagnosis turns God into a kind of monster, turns Jesus into a chronic victim, and turns you and me into guilt-filled, frightened people who must constantly beg for divine mercy. Is that any way to build a religion? And if that system is no longer viable, as I do not believe it is, then is there anything left to Christianity? Are you and I put in the position where the only way we can be a Christian is to turn our minds into first century pretzels and bend them around so that we can accept the unacceptable? Well, once we accept the fact that this is not a possibility for us, then we have three alternatives, it seems to me. One is to become a fundamentalist. That means that what we've done is to close our minds to any new knowledge. We've retreated into our religious ghettos where we can say our prayers and read our scriptures and sing our hymns and forget about the rest of the world. We don't have to engage it. And that's an interesting alternative, and many people today use that alternative. They simply close their minds to any possibility except what their fundamentalistic minds can embrace. They spend their time trying harder to be better, not recognizing that the definition of insanity is to continue to do what never has worked, with the hope that someday it will work. So we double down, fundamentalists double down on yesterday's message. They become like the country preacher who put some notes in the side of his pulpit of his sermon that said, "Argument weak, yell like hell." Fundamentalism inevitably becomes loud, militant, unquestioning, frozen, pretending to possess certainty. And there are many churches that walk this pathway today, and some of them are very successful because they meet some real needs in people for certainty and for security. Unfortunately, they do that at a very great price of integrity. But that's one possibility. You can turn your mind off to the world and buy into this out-of-touch religion. It might mean you might want to look at the fact, though, that it means you're always going to be on the wrong side of every social issue. And traditional Christianity has been on the wrong side of every public debate since the beginning of history. I haven't got time to go into all of them, but let me just touch a few. In 1215 BCE, no, CE. In 1215 CE, there was a great battle in Europe over the beginnings of democracy with the publication of the Magna Carta. The Christian church was on the side of the divine right of kings and against the Magna Carta. Now look around today and see how many people rule by divine right in our world. And look at what's happened. In the 17th and 18th century, Christianity justified slavery. It's not a secret that in America, the part of the country that practiced slavery was called the Bible Belt. And they didn't see any incompatibility. Well, you can quote the Bible, literally. The Old Testament says that the Jews are forbidden to make slaves out of fellow Jews. That's all. You ought to take your slaves from neighboring countries, it says. That puts the Canadians and the Mexicans at risk, doesn't it? And when you get to Paul, or pseudo-Paul, depending on how you count some of the epistles, you find that Paul is not in favor of getting rid of slavery. He's in favor of making slavery kinder and gentler. Well, let's be honest, a kinder and gentler slavery is better than a harsh and cruel slavery, but it's still slavery. Paul's consciousness was not formed. And when slavery finally disappeared on the battlefields of Antietam and Bull Run and Gettysburg and Appomattox, it wasn't an easy adjustment. The primarily religious Christian evangelical South simply used police dogs and fire hoses to keep segregation intact. And they quoted the Bible to do it. When the battle for women's rights came into this country, and the suffrage amendment, the 19th Amendment in 1920 that allowed women finally to vote, the Christian church was vehemently opposed to women voting. We kept quoting the Bible. I forbid a woman to have authority over a man. One of my daughters was a major in the United States Marine Corps and had 3 tours of duty in the Iraq War. She was a helicopter pilot, an attack helicopter pilot. Can you imagine saying to this major in the Marine Corps, the Bible says, I forbid a woman to have authority over a man. That's not the world we live in. And when the homosexual battle came along, It's primarily the Christian church, from the Pope to the evangelicals, that kept saying gay people are evil. Pope Benedict, whose retirement was not a minute too soon, Pope Benedict kept using the word to describe homosexuals called deviant. That's totally out of touch with modern scholarship. It's embarrassing. And after the last election in 2012, an evangelical leader in this country named Albert Mohler, who's head of the Fundamentalist Baptist Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky, was shocked and despairing because he couldn't believe that Obama could win. And someone interviewed him and he said, maybe you didn't get your message out. He said in shock, no, we got our message out and they didn't buy it. I think that's accurate. He's out of touch. And they're not going to buy it. I like to remind people that in every election, there's an 8-year turn in the electorate. Between 2008 and 2012, 4 years of voters became of voting age and 4 years of voters died. Every election is an 8-year turn in the cycle. And the world is not going to get more and more ignorant. That's why a party that's only supported by white males is never going to be in power again if they don't learn how to raise their base. And let me say that this country needs two parties that are viable and functioning and in tension with one another. They don't need one party that's gone off the charts, and either party can do that periodically, but it's not healthy for our country. Politics are like underwear. The only way you keep them clean is change them regularly. So fundamentalism is one alternative. And it's an alternative that ultimately will mean the church will be irrelevant. Oh, there'll be some short-term success, but it has no long-range future. But that's one attitude. You can face the reality of the situation. You can say, I opt out of the world and to maintain my faith tradition. And where that attitude is in the majority, you have a red state. Now, the second option when you face these realities is to decide that both Christianity and organized religion have no future and you want to give them up. You become a member of the secular society. You relegate religion to being a relic of the past. And you see church life as a hangover from another age. And you take up citizenship in the secular city. That's Harvey Cox's phrase. You take up membership in the Church Alumni Association. That's my phrase. And the fastest growing organization in the Christian West today is the Alumni Association. That's also a popular option. It's going on far faster than the rise of fundamentalism. Sometimes you don't recognize that until you get into the world and see the whole picture. And in the world we live in, Christianity is increasingly marginalized. And clergy have no great authority anymore. Clergy are barely tolerated. And less will religion perfume public life with opening invocations. I've been to the national conventions, nominating conventions of our two parties. And what you don't know when you're at home is that nobody listens when the local preacher gives the opening prayer and the closing benediction. Nobody listens. Only that comes out on TV. They don't even stop talking. They're milling around and talking and politicking and buttonholing. And the preacher's up there praying his heart out, and nobody gives a hoot. It's a really interesting thing to watch. Where this attitude of giving up organized religion totally is dominant, you have blue states. And between these two worldviews, there is absolutely no room for compromise. They're totally opposed to each other. And that's when you get political gridlock. They're not going to be compromises. They're going to be winners and losers in this struggle. No compromises. Now, there is a third alternative. You either give up the world and become a fundamentalist, or you give up religion and become worldly, or you do what this pastor and this congregation are trying to do, and that's dramatically different. And they need to be applauded. What Roger and his congregation have decided to do is to live with integrity in the real world and take their faith tradition seriously. That's not easy. They are not willing to be anti-intellectuals. They are not willing to condemn Galileo when he turns out to be right. That's what the church did. They're not willing to simply give up their faith. They're trying to force their faith and their world into a dialogue, knowing that both will be changed in the process. You can't bring into the dialogue unchanging truth or shortened lectures. What page is that? That's okay. We'll just skip a couple of pages. Nobody will ever notice. What I'm saying is that what this pastor and this church have decided to do is not an easy path. You risk everything that people believe Christianity is. And you're never going to be a majority. You don't offer what the majority will want. You're always going to be a minority. Just accept that. But that's biblical. The Bible is filled with places where you're told you are to be the saving remnant, not the majority. You are to be the salt that gives the stew its flavor. You are to be the leaven that causes the lump to rise. You are to be the light that repels just a little bit of the darkness. But that's a terribly important role. And it's a role you need to play. It's a role you need to be self-conscious about playing and stop worrying about being the majority. You find that that will not be popular, but it does have integrity. And if you follow that path seriously enough and long enough, it will be a factor in transforming both the world and the religious system that we represent. So I applaud you. To point us in that direction and to encourage us to take that journey is what I want to do in this second presentation. But let me begin at a different understanding of the origins of life, a different diagnosis of our humanity. We did not begin in perfection, only to fall into sin, from which we had to be delivered by an invasive supernatural deity who sent his Son to die on the cross for our salvation. That story no longer plays. One of the reasons Christianity, traditional Christianity, is so negative to Charles Darwin, as I suggested this morning, and to evolution, is that Darwin and evolution posits that from the very beginning there was something different from what traditional Christianity has assumed. And the whole drama of salvation comes tumbling down if Darwin is true. And he is. There's no debate about Darwin except in certain school districts. There's no debate in the scholarly world. DNA has made it very clear that basically Darwin's evolutionary ideas are correct. Oh, there's some deviations here and there. Darwin didn't get it all right, but he got the main thrust right. There was never a perfect creation from which we have fallen. There was rather a slow and evolving process of life which is still unfinished. So let me trace that briefly. This will be an exercise. If Charles Hedrick can do 15 years of biblical scholarship, I can do 13.8 billion years of creation history with equal scholarship. Our universe, we now know, because we know how to measure it today, is somewhere between 13.7 and 13.8 billion years old. And our universe was born in an explosion of an enormously dense singularity in an event that we call the Big Bang. The Big Bang was an explosion of lifeless physical matter hurled out into an infinity that was called space. There was no life in it. It would be 10 billion years before life appeared in the universe. And when it appeared, it just appeared. It came out of matter. There was no divine hand that reached down and said, let's create a little life. When matter reached a certain point of development, life emerged out of matter. Dualism is not true. Life and matter are not opposite to each other. Life emerged out of this lifeless matter about 10 billion years later. And when life did emerge, it was not the kind of life that you and I recognize. It was single-cell, non-conscious life. And all those single cells could do is reproduce. And they did it by dividing at the nucleus. So instead of one living cell, there were two living cells. They did one other thing. They pumped a little blip of oxygen into the universe. Oxygen is a product of living things. Oxygen is not native to this universe. And that's how we began. That's how life began. But once life began its journey into time, life also evolved. And over billions of years, this thing called life moved from single cells first into clusters of cells that brought complexity and cell diversification into this thing called life. And then after hundreds of millions of years, this thing called life divided into two strains. One was plant life and the other was animal life. And in time, about 1 billion years ago, out of the animal side of life emerged consciousness. It wasn't a new creation. Consciousness came out of life when life was ready to develop consciousness, just as matter produced life when matter was ready. It's all a single whole. And when consciousness began, it was very primitive. It was mostly sort of a nervous kind of antennae relationship to the external environment. And about 600 million years ago, life came out of the sea, which was its home, and began to emerge into the riverbeds and estuaries. And finally, as it evolved the capacity to do so, out of those estuaries and riverbeds onto dry land. We can telescope it. Egg-laying fish evolved into egg-laying lizards or amphibians. Then these egg-laying amphibians evolved into egg-laying reptiles. Then the reptiles began to diversify in all sorts of reptilian forms until finally the dominant reptile developed that we call the dinosaur. One of them was named Barney. And he ought to be extinct. And these dinosaurs ruled the world. They had no natural enemies. They were the top of the food chain. These dinosaurs ruled the world from about 180 million years ago until about 65 million years ago. And then something happened. We can only theorize as to what it was. But the primary assumption in the scientific world is that there was a collision of a giant meteor with the planet Earth. Maybe a meteor almost the size of the planet Mars. And that the collision, which they also believe took place in what we now call the Yucatan Peninsula in the Caribbean Sea, that collision either pushed the Earth out of its normal path and changed its climate dramatically, or raised such a dust cloud around the Earth that forms of life disappeared. The dinosaurs became extinct. Lots of other life forms became extinct. And that opened the door for the mammals to begin to rise into dominance. And our first mammalian ancestor was a little mouse-like creature who inhabited the grasslands of East Africa. And then as the mammals rose, and the mammals had a higher capacity of brain development and a higher capacity of consciousness, and as the mammals rose in power, they began to evolve in relationship to the environment in all sorts of new forms. There was the cat family and the mammoth family and the primate family, all kinds, and they began to vie for control to see who was going to be the top of the food chain. And finally, and it wasn't a long time ago, maybe 4 million years ago, out of the primate family of apes, human-like creatures finally emerged. We call them by a variety of names. They were not human yet, they were human-like. We call them things like Homo erectus, Neanderthal, and even Cro-Magnon, though that might be a little bit later. And finally, somewhere, scientists believe as late as 250,000 years ago to maybe even 100,000 years ago, this human-like creature passed over another significant boundary. That's the boundary between being a conscious animal and being a self-conscious human being. And it was at that moment that human beings arrived on the planet Earth. Human beings are, by definition, a self-conscious mammal. We are the self-conscious part of the world of nature. And that's how we got here. There was no original perfection. There was no fall from perfection. We don't need to be rescued from a fall that never happened. We cannot be restored to a status that we've never possessed. The old way of telling the Christ story simply no longer works. I'm not looking out today on a gathering of fallen sinners. I'm looking out today at a gathering of incomplete, still evolving human beings. So you and I do not need to be saved or redeemed or rescued. What we need is to be empowered to become all that we're capable of becoming, to be empowered to transcend our limits. So the question is, can we, on the basis of this different portrait of the origins of human life, find a way to tell the Christ story that's relevant to that diagnosis of our humanity? And if we cannot do that, then Christianity is over. It's doomed. But if we can do that, Christianity inevitably must break new ground. And that's the challenge that lies before the Christian world. That's the challenge that this congregation and this pastor have engaged. That's what brought them into being. So where do we begin to try to tell a new story? Well, we begin with human life. We can't begin with something we don't know about. We can't begin with something outside human life. We begin with what we know. Human life is self-conscious. And we are the only creature in the world that uses words like I and me. To be self-conscious is not easy. To be self-conscious is to see the world from a center within yourself. You're not part of the world. You see the world from a center within yourself. The world is out there, not in here. Self-conscious people are the only creatures that know they are alive. Dogs don't know that they're alive. If you ask a dog, are you alive? The dog would know what you're talking about. But self-conscious people know that they're alive. We also know that we will die. No other animal knows that. Oh, people always tell me about elephants who go off to the elephant burial ground. That's instinctual behavior. Elephants don't write life insurance policies or wills. Only human beings do that. Only human beings know that they're immortal. Only human beings know that they will die. Only human beings wonder about whether life has any meaning. And so only human beings are chronically anxious. Oh, animals will be anxious when a predator is about to pounce. Human beings are always anxious. That's the nature of our humanity, to be chronically anxious. Why do you think we have a drug industry? Human beings are the only animals that commit suicide. Oh, we might argue about that with some bird species. When they lose their mate, they seem to wander off and die. I understand that. I'd wander off and die if I lost Christine. But again, that's not volitional behavior. But human beings can decide, I don't want any more. of life. It's more than I can bear. Human beings are the only animals I know that become drug addicts. Prozac is not for dogs. Oh, there might be some veterinarians that will prescribe it because a doctor will prescribe anything. But we are drug addicts. And every one of you is a drug addict. Don't think that drug addicts are urban kids on cocaine. It's the nature of human life to use drugs. You use them every day. You don't have to raise your hands, but how many of you got up this morning without caffeine? How many of you go to sleep tonight without alcohol? A few. Always a few members of the Women's Christian Temperance Union around. But by and large, every human being is a drug addict. We don't do it as much as we once did, but nicotine is a drug, folks. And look how we packaged it. We packaged it in a little short stick form. And have you ever noticed that sucking on a cigarette is almost an identical experience with sucking on your mother's breast? Have you ever noticed that the smoke, the warmth of the smoke is about the same temperature as mother's milk? What we did was to take a drug and package it in a way that we could still enjoy the security of nursing infants at our mother's breast and be adults. It's really difficult to nurse your mother's breast when you're 45. But we just fixed it so we could have this sensation in a socially acceptable way. It is tough to be human. We always have to cope with the potential meaninglessness and the mortality and the finitude that is human life. Another thing about human life that I think we need to embrace is that we are deeply interdependent. Oh, that's a new learning. The old era of rugged individualism is the myth by which we live. That's why the gun laws are so hard to change, because the myth of independence is part of our psyche. But deep down, it's that individuation that's the myth. We're deeply related. Do you know that your body and my body is made up of the same stuff as the farthest planet around the farthest star in the farthest galaxy of this universe? It's all the same stuff. You and I are made out of stardust. And the DNA discovery, which is less than 50 years ago, has showed without any doubt that life is one unfolding whole. And that you and I are just the self-conscious part of it, but we're deeply related. We have about a 99.9% identical DNA with the great apes. That's far more than the first families of Virginia like to admit. As one English lady was quoted as saying when Darwin suggested we were all descended from apes, she said, "Well, I hope nobody knows." But in addition to the great apes, we have DNA connections with cabbages. We have DNA connection with the plankton of the sea. Life is one unfolding whole, and we are all part of it. And so if you're going to understand human life, you must understand the characteristics of living things. And one of the characteristics of every living thing is that living things are survival-oriented. That's the nature of what life is all about. Every living thing is motivated to survive. And all you have to do is study life in any form, and you discover that. Every plant, every vine, every insect, every animal is in a survival mode. They don't think about it, they just act it out. When I was writing my book on eternal life, my doorway into eternal life was to study life itself. So we went a lot of places in this world to look at life. We went to the Amazon rainforest. We went to the Great Barrier Reef. We went to Kruger Park, the great game park in South Africa. And we looked at life in all its forms. And every living thing is survival-oriented. The vines on the forest of the Amazon jungle will slink along the floor until they find a tree big enough so that they can climb it and take in the sun and live. Let me tell you about two of them that were particularly dramatic. In northern Queensland in Australia, near the city of Cairns, north of Brisbane, there's a tidal river up near the Great Barrier Reef. And because it's a tidal river, it has a lot of salt in the water. Along both sides of this tidal river is a plant called the mangrove tree. That's a freshwater plant, but it's living in a tidal basin, and it either learns to live with salt water or it dies. And so the mangrove tree has adapted because it's survival-oriented. First thing it did was to grow an enormous rootage system. The roots were hairy roots, and they began to filter the salt. Still, too much salt got into the mangrove tree. And so the mangrove tree, through some means that I don't understand, and I don't know any zoologist that does or botanist that does, the mangrove tree developed a way that it could take this excessive salt and sort of march it toward particular leaves. And those leaves would absorb the salt. And they would turn orange, and they would fall off. They called them the sacrificial leaves of the mangrove tree. They die so that the plant can live. And the mangrove tree didn't think this out. This is just sort of natural to life. Everything in the world is oriented to survive. Second illustration, a little bit higher level of life. In the Amazon rainforest, we saw thousands, 10,000 parakeets at a time. Most people only seen a parakeet in a cage in somebody's house. We saw tens of thousands of parakeets. The parakeets live on the fruits of the rainforest. The problem is that the nutrients that they need to live are in the seeds of the fruits, and the seeds are toxic to parakeets. So if they eat the nutrients they need, they will die of toxicity. So how are they going to work with that? So about 25 years ago, a Peruvian scientist discovered some things about parakeets that we didn't know. Namely, throughout the rainforest, there are things called clay licks, where the soil is filled with antitoxins. And we found a place where we could sit and watch 10,000 parakeets descend on this clay lick, and each of them get sufficient antitoxins so they go off and eat the fruits of the forest and not die. That's pretty elaborate. They had their Alka-Seltzer before they had dinner. And they survived. You have evolved through survival. Every creature does it. Now, what makes you think we human beings aren't survival-oriented? We're self-conscious survival-oriented. Human beings share because survival is part of our DNA. So let's face some facts that every human being is motivated primarily to survive. And as soon as you install survival as your highest value, and that's installed by our biology, you cannot help but be self-centered. You will view everything and every experience from the vantage point of whether it helps or hurts your own survival. So the nature of humanity is to be survival-oriented, self-centered. And you can't do anything about it. It's universal. It's part of our DNA. It's in our biology. You don't choose it. That's just who you are. And it was this quality of human life that our religious ancestors observed. And because they couldn't blame something that they saw as evil on God, they had to come up with an explanation. So they had God making a perfect world and human beings falling into self-centeredness. We evolved into survival-oriented, self-conscious creatures. And we cannot help it. That's why human beings are afraid of anybody who's different. That's why we're xenophobic. We don't like people that are different, with different brains or different skin colors or different eye slants. or different sexual orientation or different language or different religion because it's a threat to our survival. That's what xenophobia is all about. That's where prejudice comes from. Everybody shares in that. That's not a moral issue. That's an issue of our existence. That's why we have such religious hostility toward people who believe differently. That's why we have religious wars and religious persecution. By God, if you don't believe like me, you're a threat to my survival. It makes no rational sense. If you don't perceive of God the way I perceive of God, I'm going to kill you. That's not rational. That's an irrational survival instinct at work. This universal human behavior was explained as an indelible fall from which we could not rescue ourselves. And so the story of Jesus was told in terms of overcoming that fall. Jesus came to human life not to rescue us from a fall that never happened, and not to restore us to a status that we've never possessed, but to give us the possibility of transcending our limits in the next stage of our own evolutionary development. Let me just ask some questions. Is spirit something that emerges out of self-consciousness? Is it the next stage in our development? Just as life emerged out of matter and consciousness emerged out of life and self-consciousness emerged out of consciousness, does Jesus represent a new breakthrough from self-consciousness into a universal consciousness? Is the motion from our humanity toward a kind of divinity? Is our Christian story more about the human breaking into divinity than it is about the divine invading the human, which is the way we've always told the story before? Is Jesus not the Savior, the Redeemer, or the Rescuer? But is Jesus the call and the empowerment to lift us beyond our limits into a new experience of what it means to be human? Has evolution stopped, or is it still ongoing? Are we on the verge of the next breakthrough? Now hold that thought for just a moment. Let me walk you very quickly through the Christian story from this new paradigm's point of view. Let me take you first to the writings of Paul. He wrote between 51 and 64. He was the first writer of anything in the New Testament. That's about as close to the Jesus of history as we can get. And when you read Galatians, which is Paul's second epistle, you find Paul saying a rather remarkable thing. He says, once you get inside the Christ experience, you discover that there's no longer a Jew nor a Greek, or Jew or Gentile. There's no longer a tribal boundary. There's no longer male or female, no longer a gender boundary. There's no longer bond or free, no longer an economic boundary. And think of the other things you could put in that. No longer Jew or Muslim, no longer Catholic or Protestant, no longer gay or straight. All the divisions upon which we build our security disappear. There's only a common humanity. There's something about the Christ experience that lifts us into a new understanding of what it means to be human, where survival no longer drives us, where we escape our tribal boundaries, our defensive shells, and enter into a new understanding of life. That's the earliest witness in the New Testament to a new possibility. Now go to the first gospel, Mark. Read the story of the crucifixion. You'll discover that Mark puts a Gentile at the foot of the cross to interpret it. What a strange thing for a Jew to do. A Gentile. He wasn't even kosher. He hadn't been circumcised. He didn't know the Torah. He was unclean. You put a Gentile at the foot of the cross and let him interpret the life of Jesus? So Mark has a Roman soldier at the foot of the cross looking at the dead, limp body of Jesus. And he saw how he died. He saw he was not possessed by the survival mentality, that he was free to give his life away. He was free, according to the tradition, even to love those who were taking his life from him. That's not human behavior. That's something different. And so this soldier says, truly that's what God is like. Now, that's not what we quote in the text. We say in the text that this soldier said, truly that man was the Son of God, as if he had just passed the Council of Nicaea 101. That's 300 years later. They didn't think that way. He said, once you see a human life that is not driven by survival, that's able to transcend that limit, then you see something of what God is like. That's what God is like. Then you go to Matthew, second gospel, middle 80s. And Matthew wraps his story inside an interpretive envelope. He opens his story by telling you the birth narrative. It's the first time the birth narrative has been told. It doesn't come into the Christian tradition until the 9th decade. And Matthew opens his story by putting a star in the sky. Now, what's so unusual about a star? It doesn't just shine on the land of the Jews. Everybody in the world sees that star. There are no boundaries. National boundaries are not eternal. Because that star shines in the sky, unclean Gentiles, we call them wise men, begin to follow that star to escape the boundaries on their own humanity. That's what the wise men are about. They're not about three guys who went to a costume party and hopped on camels and followed a star that wandered so slowly across the sky they could keep up with it. As a matter of fact, there are no camels in that story. We've inserted them. There are no camels in Matthew. Go home today and read it. We put the camels in there because it helped us to understand it, but it's not in the Bible. There's also no stable in the Luke story. The stable is something we created. And there are no animals because there's no stable for the animals to be in. They aren't there. There's not even one who said, do you see what I see? They just aren't there. What we've done is to populate these stories with our own images. We've been to too many pageants. Matthew says that when Jesus entered the world, there was a power that drew people beyond their tribal fears and their defense barriers to share in this new vision of what it means to be human. It's a dramatic and powerful story. Then when Matthew gets to the end of his story, he wraps the other parenthesis. Matthew is the first gospel writer who has the risen Jesus say anything to anybody. Jesus comes out of the sky in the last 5 verses of Matthew's gospel. He's not resurrected from the tomb. He comes out of the sky. He's been exalted to the heavens. However, that's to be understood. And the disciples climb up the mountain, and Jesus comes out of the sky, and he confronts them, and he gives them his final word. We call it the Great Commission. Go into all the world and proclaim the gospel. And we think that means go be a missionary and convert the heathen. They didn't think that way. What Matthew is saying is that once you understand the humanity of Jesus, then you've got to move beyond the barriers that impede your own humanity. You've got to go out to those people that you have declared to be unclean, uncircumcised, unbaptized, Gentile, foreign. You've got to go across the boundaries of your insecurity to the other human beings. And when you get to them, you've got to tell them that the love of God embraces them also. That's what the gospel means. Go out to all those that you have judged in your insecurity and proclaim that they too are the beloved of God. That's what Matthew's Great Commission is about. It's not a missionary challenge. Most missionary work in the Christian church is in the service of ecclesiastical power, not in the service of enhancing humanity. Then go to Luke. You'll be glad there are only 4 Gospels. Go to Luke and see what he says. Luke is the one who tells the Pentecost story. It's never been told before. Luke is the one who has the Christian community gathered in an upper room after the resurrection, waiting for they know not what. And Luke says the power of the Spirit came upon them. And it didn't make them religious. It lifted them beyond their tribal boundaries and beyond their security systems. There were Parthians and Medes and Elamites and dwellers in Mesopotamia and all sorts of other foreigners. And what happened is that they were lifted beyond their tribal boundaries so that they could recognize the common humanity and they could share life as human beings with one another apart from survival mentality. They were lifted to a new understanding of what it means to be human. That's what the Holy Spirit is all about. And finally, go to John. John is the gospel that is so very different. The cross in John's gospel is the climax. It's not the resurrection. The cross is the moment when the glory of Jesus is revealed. When I am lifted up, I will draw all people to myself. When I am lifted up on the cross, I will draw all people to myself. The cross in John's gospel is the holiest moment because Jesus is portrayed as escaping the last vestiges of that survival mentality that marks human life. There he is on the cross giving his life away in love. And when you see the Son of Man lifted up, he says in John's gospel, then you will know I am, not I am he. Then you will know I am. When you see life being given away with no regard for survival, you see a picture of who God is. That's what John is saying. And the ultimate revelation of God in John's gospel is the cross. And Jesus is portrayed as fully human, and yet he breaks a boundary on our humanity and enters into that which we call divine. How does he do it? He does it by escaping survival mentality. If I could take the Jesus story and reduce it to a single sentence, it would be, there's nothing any of you can ever do and nothing any of you can ever be that will separate you from the love of God. That's what the gospel is all about. If you deny him, he will love you. If you betray him, he will love you. If you forsake him, he will love you. If you persecute him, he will love you. If you kill him, he will love you. How else can you live out that message? That's what the cross is. No matter what you do, no matter who you are, this love embraces you and empowers you to escape the limits of your survival-driven humanity and enter into the meaning of God, the life of the Spirit. That's why John portrays Jesus and God as intimately related. It's not incarnation. That's 300 years later. It's the human becoming open to the power of the divine so the divine can flow in him and through him. It's people recognizing that Jesus is the vine and you and I are the branches attached to the vine, and the vine is part of who God is. When human life escapes its survival drive and is capable of living for others in a new understanding of what it means to be human, then the divine and the human flow together in some kind of mystical union. That's what John's gospel is about. That's why I entitled the book, The Tales of a Jewish Mystic. And this is when Jesus can say, the Father and I are one. And this is when Jesus can be quoted as saying, I don't know that he ever said it, can be quoted as saying, when you have seen me, you have seen the Father. When you have seen the fullness of humanity, you have seen the nature of God. And that is when a new Christianity for a new world begins to emerge. And I submit that that image is sufficiently powerful to enable the Christian movement to live again in a new and dramatic way. Let me conclude with a text. Every preacher has to have a text. And my favorite text in the Johannine material, and that's my favorite part of my study life at this moment, at least it was until I just completed the book. Jesus is in a conversation with his disciples. You and I only hear a part of the conversation. It's like listening in on a telephone call. We're only on one end. But the disciples, you have to sort of recreate it. The disciples seem to say to Jesus, Jesus, tell us who you are. Tell us what you're about. Tell us why you came. Did you come to make us religious? Jesus says, no, I didn't come to make you religious. There's an awful lot of religion in the world already, and most of it's pretty destructive. And the world doesn't need more religion. I didn't come to make you religious. Well, Jesus, did you come to make us moral and righteous? Jesus says, no, I didn't come for that reason either. The world's got an awful lot of moral people who are very moral and very righteous, and they know a great deal about judging. They know almost nothing about loving. No, I didn't come to make you moral or righteous. Well, did you come, Jesus, so that we would have the true faith? We could claim to be the true church. We could say our Pope is infallible, our Bible is inerrant, we have the truth. No one can come to God except through my religion. That's a familiar chant in religious circles. Jesus said, no, I didn't come for that reason either. It's my experience with people who think that they have it all wrapped up, that they have the truth, is that they always put their wagons in a circle and start shooting at other people. There's no life in that. And there's a note of desperation. The disciples say, well, why did you come? Why did you come? What are you about? And that's when Jesus responds with the text that I think ought to ring out through all the ages and ought to be emblazoned on the door of every congregation. I have come, he said, that you might have life and that you might have it abundantly. That's the business we're in. We're in the life business. We're in the business of expanding the life of every person. That's why it is impossible to be Christian and to be prejudiced at the same time. That's why when I watch the Christian church debate issues of human sexuality about which they know almost nothing and spend their time saying who is acceptable in the house of God, that is so a violation of what I understand the Christ to be as to be repelling to me. That's not what it's about. I have come that you might have life. I've come to call you and to empower you beyond the limits of your humanity to escape your survival-driven, prejudiced life, to call you into something that's different, to let you pass from self-consciousness into universal consciousness, from expanded humanity into divinity. The way you become divine is to become fully human. Dualism is dead. They are not separate categories, bodies and souls, flesh and spirit, heaven and earth, God and human. That division must cease. It's all a spectrum. It's all growing from matter to life, to consciousness, to self-consciousness, to universal consciousness, to living in the reality of God. Jesus is one of those breakthrough lives that sets those barriers aside so that we have some vision of what it means when the human and the divine come together. I think that's worth proclaiming to the world. Well, thank you for your attention. Thank you very much. Thank you. I trust that you recognize that I recognize you're also clapping for